There was once tech giants that made one mistake and it cost them everything. Starting with our first story, back in the 90s before you were born, Nvidia wasn't the dominant GPU company as it is today. It was 3DFX. Gaming back then was an awful, blocky 320 by 200 resolution with horrible FPS at around 15 to 20 FPS. And here is where 3DFX came for the rescue. They introduced GPUs for 3D gaming in home computers with their Voodoo lineup. They allowed you to play at a resolution of 640 by 480 at a frame rate of 30 to 60 FPS, which was leagues ahead of its time. People loved the Voodoo series, but sadly, here comes the twist. Despite the success that the company made, it crumbled by the end of the 90s as they relied too heavily on Glide, and they kept relying on Glide even when it became obsolete compared to DirectX. And Nvidia GPUs started catching up to the performance of the Voodoo graphics cards. As 3DFX were witnessing their own death, they decided that they had one final push. 3DFX launched the Voodoo 5 6000, a GPU that combined 4 GPU chips into one card, which is unheard of even until this day. However, it wasn't really optimal. The GPU required so much power to the point that it required an external power supply just for it. Like, imagine plugging your PC into the power plug and then plugging your GPU right next to it. Only 1,000 of these were made, and there was no official price. Realistically, however, it was supposed to cost you around $600 in the 2000s, but that is just speculation. And sadly, 3DFX couldn't save themselves, as Nvidia decided to dig the final nail in the coffin of 3DFX. So Nvidia went ahead and released the GeForce 256, and that GPU obliterated the Voodoo 5 6000 with a lot less power consumption and a lot less heat. The mistake that 3DFX made was trying to push the same architecture so far, brute forcing it to produce more power, and it didn't work. And in the late 2000s, Nvidia acquired the remains of 3DFX, and since 3DFX are the ones who invented putting multiple GPUs together, it is why later on we saw technologies like SLI or NVLink. There are modded versions and revisions of the Voodoo 5 6000 made by the community. However, it is considered to be an ancient piece of tech that is very expensive and is very hard to find. The price of this GPU can go all the way up to $15,000 if you want to buy them nowadays. This should teach you that if you don't adapt, if you don't innovate, you're gonna die, just like 3DFX. Back when computers were still weak and pathetic, they used to display 4 colors only and were incapable of running more than one application at a time, if even. And here is where a giant revolutionary device was released, the Amiga 1000. This machine was insane for its time, literally a supercomputer disguised as a PC. This thing managed to output 4,000 colors compared to the 4 that we were used to at the time, and it was capable of running multiple applications at the same time. The performance difference between the Amiga 1000 and a normal home computer would sometimes go up to 1000% in some scenarios. Not only that, but it also had a video production system called Video Toaster, which is funny. Video Toaster enabled you as a home PC owner to make CGI and produce videos and even movies if you're talented enough that would otherwise cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars to get the hardware required to do so. You basically have a supercomputer at home. And here begs the question, how on earth such a revolutionary device led the company to bankruptcy? Despite the insane amount of success that the Amiga 1000 achieved, the later generations of the Amiga were basically the same, except for very minor changes. But why would they do that? You see, the original Amiga was made by a small corporation with visionary engineers like Jay Miner. I don't know what's up with funny names in this video. Anyways, they didn't have enough money to fund the Amiga series, so they manufactured a third-party joysticks for Atari just to fund the Amiga series. But after the gaming market collapsed in 1983, that whole deal went out the window. By 1984, Amiga Corp was desperate to finish the Amiga 1000 project, but they struggled to find any fundings. They had no choice but to accept a $500,000 loan from Atari on the condition that if the Amiga 1000 doesn't pay the debt in 1 month, Atari will inherit all of Amiga chip rights for free. This is where the savior Commodore comes in. They bought Amiga Corporation for $24 million and paid the Atari loan. Sadly, however, it goes downhill from here. As this new management didn't understand the Amiga, they proceeded to make a cut-down version of the Amiga 1000 and called it the Amiga 500, which sold 2.6 million units worldwide. However, the management team was terrible as they refused to fund the Amiga on things that would add mere 50 cents to the production cost. Years later, computers started catching up to the Amiga, and slowly but surely, the Amiga became obsolete and useless. And as we see with companies, before they die, they usually try to make one more push, and here is where the Amiga 4000 was released. But it still flopped. And one of the reasons the Amiga 4000 flopped so terribly is because of the insane price. It cost around $3,600, and a maxed out computer at the time cost around anywhere between $1,800 to $2,400, making the Amiga 4000 a horrible deal. Later on, they tried one more time just to make sure that maybe there's still some life in the Amiga Corporation, and that is where they made a stripped down version of the Amiga, which was sort of like a console, and they called it the Amiga CD32, which actually was a success in the UK, but they faced a lawsuit they lost that banned them in the US. At some point, they couldn't even afford to pay the shipping companies to deliver the product to the customer, and in late 1994, Commodore went bankrupt and sold all of its assets to multiple companies, and that was the end of the Amiga lineup. The device that the engineers worked so hard for, and they actually achieved to make a revolutionary device, but it was terrible management and terrible corporation greed that led the device to becoming obsolete. Back in time when Windows and macOS were barely capable of running anything at all, a former Apple executive decided to make his own operating system for the sole purpose of being as fast and responsive as possible. And when it launched, it was insane. You could basically run 8 videos and multiple applications all at the same time, compared to Windows and macOS who were barely capable of running one. It also had its own hardware called the B-Box, a $3,000 device that had barely any software and only sold around 1,800 units. Because of this, the only hope that BOS had was to be adopted, and that actually nearly happened in 1966. Apple wanted to buy the BOS, but the price that BN Corporation asked for was insane. $300 million. Apple was like, no thank you. After that, BOS was ported to x86 computers in the late 90s, but support was limited, and the majority of people were still using macOS and Windows, which caused the OS to slowly decline over time. Near the end, they released the BOS R5 Personal Edition, which was a free OS, but that didn't do well either, due to Linux being the free OS that most people would use. The OS development ended in 2001 when a company called Palm bought the B Corporation for $11 million, which is a fraction of what the company asked for just for the operating system alone. Despite the OS vanishing, its legacy still lives on, as the open source community made the Heiko OS, which is nearly identical to the BOS, and it's still maintained and updated to this day.